Welcome back to the Liz Wheeler Show. We're going to dedicate the show today to talking about the Hegseth stuff. The stuff that's going on with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. What is the Hegseth stuff, you might be asking? Well, senior staff around Hegseth at the Department of Defense, they're being fired basically left and right. And we're talking high-level individuals around Hegseth. And the reason that they're being fired, allegedly, is for leaking. Hegseth has said publicly, he said this on Fox News, that investigations into who is leaking and what is being leaked, that those investigations are ongoing. That's the what is the Hegseth stuff. The mainstream media and neocons, so the uniparty folks, the swampy people in Washington, D.C., are using this personnel battle as an excuse to once again call for Hegseth to be fired. Whoever said there's nothing new under the sun really nailed it this time, because they've been trying to get Hegseth since the moment Trump announced him as nominee for Secretary of the Department of Defense. Meanwhile, while people are gossiping about this and about this personnel battle, people are walking around not realizing that we are on the verge of a major war about to break out in the Middle East. And we're wanting to talk about gossip. So let's just break down exactly what's happening here and what the implications are of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes in the administration, in the Department of Defense, and in Washington, D.C. So first of all, we know two things to be true. Number one, there is a vicious, concerted effort to oust Hegseth, or maybe this is even worse than ousting him, or try to force him into becoming a neocon. And we, the American people, are not going to turn on Hegseth just because the mainstream media tells us to, or just because the neocons want us to. We're not going to fall for that kind of BS anymore. We don't fall for mainstream media hit pieces. But think about for a second what has happened to Pete Hegseth since the day that President Trump announced him for SecDef. First of all, he was mocked initially out of the gate just for being a Fox News personality. Immediately, when that didn't work, he was accused of being a drunk at work. When that was debunked, he was subject to false allegations of sexual assault, which not only were false, had actually been investigated by the police and found to not be true. But our show and all of you knew right from the get-go that these attacks were only because Hegseth was anti-woke. We voted for anti-woke. That's why we cast our ballots for Trump. And because Hegseth promised from the get-go to carry out President Trump's America First agenda, which is the purpose of secretaries of these executive agencies to begin with. Then, of course, Pete Hegseth just barely squeaked through his Senate confirmation. Again, thanks to you, the pressure that you put on Senator Joni Ernst, letting her know that she wouldn't be long in Washington, D.C. She wouldn't be enjoying her powerful position in the Senate if she subverted your vote and President Trump's nomination of Pete Hegseth. And of course, eventually she caved, so Hegseth squeaked through. Then fast forward just a couple of weeks, we're barely into the Trump administration, and we have the Atlantic Jeffrey Goldberg Signal chat pseudo scandal. Now, what happened there was a Signal chat. Signal is an encrypted messaging app, a Signal group chat between principals in the U.S. government. So we're talking Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller, Susie Wiles, Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, in addition to Pete Hegseth, talking about this attack that the U.S. was about to carry out on the Houthi rebels in Yemen. But Jeffrey Goldberg, who is the Never Trump editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, was somehow added to this group chat. How the heck was he added to this group chat? We spent multiple episodes talking about what could have happened. How could that have been? Was it that Mike Waltz, who in my opinion, and I back this opinion up with fact, was it that Mike Waltz had been previously texting with Jeffrey Goldberg, and so he was on a recent contact that your phone might suggest when you go to add someone else to a group chat? I think that's a very plausible explanation. There's also a plausible explanation that was kind of recently reported. I believe it was by The Guardian. It might have been by the Daily Mail, one of those two, that said that actually it was a matter of an iPhone snafu. There was a text message or an email with a signature card, including a phone number, that was copied and pasted into a text message and was accidentally added to someone else's contact card. That's how Jeffrey Goldberg's name got into Mike Waltz's phone. It almost doesn't even matter at this point because Mike Waltz has a neocon background, which put a pin in that. We'll get back to that. Then, of course, by the way, we won't get back to that. We're going to stay here for 1 second. That all should have been blamed on Mike Waltz. And yet the media used that instead as a way to call for the resignation of Pete Hegseth. How the heck was Pete Hegseth responsible for that in any way, shape, or form? He wasn't, but neocons and the media hate Pete Hegseth, so they tried to pin it on him. And so now we get to this today. This fake news from NPR that came out yesterday saying that Trump is looking for replacements for Pete Hegseth, that Pete Hegseth is about to be fired as Secretary of Defense. This is fake news, according to the White House. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that it's not only not true, they were relying on one anonymous source who clearly doesn't know what they're talking about. Now, the intent of all of this chaos around Pete Hegseth is, of course, to cause such chaos, because causing chaos allows personnel decisions to fly under the radar. Now, personnel decisions at the Department of Defense or at the National Security Council are important because personnel are the people who enact policy. So if we want President Trump's America First policy to be enacted, we need people in positions of power who have the ability and the philosophy to do it. If you decimate personnel underneath the secretary level, of course, but it includes the secretary as well. But if you decimate personnel, then you're not going to have anybody who will enact policy. In addition to that, this lack of an ability to enact an America First policy, the left, and it's not even just the left, it's this uniparty in Washington, D.C., these neocons that are sometimes on the right as well, they want to either plant or keep unfriendlies in positions in the Department of Defense at the National Security Council so that they can restage the playbook that they used on President Trump in his first term during the Ukraine impeachment. You remember what happened with that. They used unfriendlies that still had access to Trump in the Oval Office, reading the transcript of the call that Trump had with Zelensky from Ukraine, and making these wild allegations publicly through leakers to the mainstream media to make it look like President Trump was doing something inappropriate that then spurred a congressional impeachment of President Trump. This is what the left wants to do again. The Democrats are just waiting until 2026, hoping that they regain control over the House and the Senate, and they want to use impeachment again to stymie President Trump's America First agenda. So that's the first thing that we know for a fact. We know that the media and the neocons have come for Pete Hegseth from the beginning because they don't like him, and we know they want to use any means possible, including personnel, both getting rid of people who are going to be effective at implementing America First policy and planting or keeping unfriendlies in these positions of power so that they can undermine President Trump. So it's really important. This is a bigger story than a lot of people understand, because while they think it's gossip and personnel, what's happening with Hegseth, what's happening with Trump, what's happening with Mike Waltz, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense. Meanwhile, people are just walking around thinking nothing important is going on, and we are on the verge of a major war. Do you know what's happening in Rome right now? There are two things that we know about the Hegseth stuff. About the people around Hegseth who have been fired, about the mainstream media and the neocon attack on Hegseth and what it means. And the first is that the left and the neocons are going to stop at nothing to try to get rid of Hegseth and to try to get rid of any personnel who would be effective in enacting President Trump's America First agenda. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's a lot more that meets the eye to these firings at the Department of Defense. In fact, I have a lot of unanswered questions about what's going on here. There's been many conflicting reports, even from otherwise credible reporters, about who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. Were these people leaking? If so, to whom were they leaking and what were they leaking? Because I got to be honest with you, as someone in the media, I can tell you top-level government officials leak all the time. And it's not just malicious leaks. This is part of an active or a proactive strategy that politicians use all the time. They strategically leak information that helps their cause to media figures all the time. So just because you leak something doesn't mean it's a malicious leak. It doesn't mean that you're trying to undermine your boss. In fact, oftentimes bosses are left in the dark about leaking because they wouldn't be able to give you permission to make that leak. And so communications teams make that call. And what's leaked ultimately helps the agenda, and okay, everybody wins. That's kind of this standard operating procedure in Washington, D.C., and most everybody in politics or in the media is aware of this. That being said, there are a lot of unanswered questions about these firings of these staffers around Pete Hegseth. Were the people fired? We're talking Dan Caldwell and others. Were they actually leaking? Their denials Dan Caldwell, for example, went on Tucker Carlson last night. He denied leaking classified information. Okay, that doesn't mean that he denies leaking anything. It was a narrow question. I have more questions for him. At the same time, Pete Hegseth says that he fired them specifically, which would insinuate that this wasn't some deep state hatchet job to get rid of very effective individuals in the Department of Defense who were, counter to the neocon policy. It's somewhat confusing to discern exactly what's going on. Were they victims of a deep state because they're against forever wars? Because a lot of times that's justification. That's all that's needed for the neocons and the uniparty in Washington, D.C. to go after you if you don't want to engage in forever wars. Well, or maybe they did leak. Did they leak the Iran attack plans because they wanted to stop those types of attacks? And the Iran attack plans that I'm referring to are a joint plan between Israel and the U.S. that almost came to fruition. It was an attack that was supposed to happen on Iran's nuclear facilities, and at the last moment, the U.S. stopped it. Well, there's a lot of disagreement in Washington, D.C., not just disagreement between left and right, but disagreement within the Trump administration about what should be done about Iran. So we don't know. We don't know. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered. There's a couple of scenarios that could have happened here. So it's pretty widely understood right now that in some of these executive agencies, there are widespread polygraph tests that are being given to a lot of high-ranking officials to see if they're leakers, to see if they're truth tellers, to see if they're friendlies. So what could have happened? Scenario number one, well, these people around Hegseth could have failed a polygraph test. But does that really tell you anything? Does that tell you whether they were leaking maliciously or whether it was a friendly leak, maybe to a friend, maybe a strategic leak to help achieve an agenda item of the Trump administration? We don't know. We don't know. We don't know. You should be asking these questions. You should ask your government officials for answers to these questions. It is strange, I will note. The only people who seem to get fired from positions in the Pentagon or the National Security Council, the only people who get fired for leaking, I should say, seem to be anti-neocon, which seems to be more than a coincidence. So all of this, suffice to say, we know that there's a war going on inside the Pentagon, a war inside the whole administration between those whose philosophy is America first when it comes to foreign policy and neocons who want forever wars. This is not really new information. This tension between neocons and America first has existed since the first Trump administration. The bigger picture here, and this is why this is more important, is this is not just a battle within the Pentagon or a war within the Trump administration. There's an actual war that's on the table here. An actual war that could impact you. Right now in Italy, in Rome, there are talks between Iran and the United States over Iran's nuclear capacity. You'll remember back when President Obama had the disastrous Iran nuclear deal, then Trump pulled us out of the Iran nuclear deal because it was unfair and Iran was cheating anyway. Well, now President Trump is back at the table with Iran, and they are trying to come quickly to an agreement to bring peace to that area. But what's not being talked about is the third party to this. Israel does not want Iran to have any nuclear capacity. Now, there are two types of nuclear capacities. There's civilian nuclear capacities for energy, and then there's weaponized nuclear capacities for nukes, obviously. Israel does not want Iran to have any nuclear capacity. No weaponized nuclear capacity, no civilian nuclear capacity. But the United States, the Trump administration, has said that in these negotiations that perhaps a civilian nuclear program in Iran is okay, as long as they don't exceed certain enrichment thresholds. They were already doing this. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that deal is what will be the deal it's on the table now. Maybe that's the deal that will come to fruition. This is somewhat of a change from previous U.S. foreign policy, and yet, what's the alternative? If we attack Iran's nuclear facility, it's going to cause total war with Iran, which is another forever war in the Middle East. That is not something the American people voted for. We voted for the opposite. But again, going back to these tensions between maybe what Israel wants and what the United States wants when it comes to Israel, we now have Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, who earlier in the show, I said is a neocon. He used to work for Dick Cheney. He worked in the Bush Pentagon. He's steeped in the neocon ideology. He now has a new employee who is a former Ministry of Defense employee for Israel. She has an old boss who said very blatantly that, quote, "There's never been a better time to dismantle Iran's nuclear program and finish off the regime." And I think that right there, the reason that I bring that up is because when President Trump won the election, when we, the American people, voted for him because he said he would not engage in forever wars, one of the things that did is it forced the neocons in both parties to admit that they're neocons. It forced these people who want forever wars to actually say, no, we want regime change. We want to topple leaders in other countries. We want to engage in these military actions. And contrast this with before, they kind of tried to hide that. Israel might still be hiding that in a sense. This canceled joint strike with Israel against Iran, it was ostensibly sold to the United States as securing or preventing Iran from transitioning their civilian nuclear program into a weaponized nuclear program. And yet, maybe it wasn't sold honestly to the United States. Maybe it was always intended to spark regime change in Iran, which would be a forever war. And it was just intended to be a way to draw the U.S. involvement into that forever war. Fortunately, that joint attack was canceled thanks to the work of J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard and Susie Wiles, who were all against it. President Trump made the right decision and called that off. So that's how we got here. So let's go back to Rome for a second. These nuclear negotiations between the United States and Iran, actual war is on the table. We don't want the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon. They're not rational actors. They are religious extremists who want the total annihilation of the state of Israel, who want annihilation of the United States of America. They call Israel the little Satan. They call America the great Satan. There are serious repercussions to what's happening here. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to deliberately start a war with them. So that brings us then to, okay, who's carrying out these negotiations? Well, it's Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff, who's Trump's envoy to the Middle East, said very bluntly, President Trump told me that Iran can't be enriching uranium past the threshold that would cause it to be weaponized. Steve Witkoff is not a swamp creature here. He's not a politician. He's Trump's real estate buddy who was brought in to make deals because he's so good at making deals. And you'll notice that the neocons, the uniparty, and the left all dislike Steve Witkoff. That's a good thing. That shows us that President Trump understands that Steve Witkoff is going to be loyal to the America First agenda. He's not here to win a popularity contest. All of this. So I told you this was more complicated because actual war is on the table here. And this war is playing out. It makes the gossip at the Department of Justice, in one sense, look like child's play, but in another sense, it reminds us how serious it is to have the proper personnel in place. Because if the proper personnel is not in place, then your son or your daughter, your husband, your wife, might be sent to war in Iran. Is that what you want? Is that what we want?